Before we get started, I want to thank our co-sponsors, North Pacific Yearly Meeting, the Whatcom Human Rights Task Force, Bellingham Friends Meeting, and I also want to thank everyone, many of you who are here, who helped spread the word about this event. And I would like to express deep appreciation to Pro Bono ASL for providing us with live ASL interpretation. And now I would like to introduce our speaker. Taylor Stewart grew up in Portland, Oregon, and graduated from the University of Portland in 2018 with a degree in communication. That same year, he founded the Oregon Remembrance Project to help communities unearth stories of injustice and engage in necessary truth-telling and repair to reconcile historical harm. And he'll tell you about how that came to happen. Then in June 2021, he graduated from Portland State University with a master's degree in social work. And he continues to work with communities throughout Oregon to connect historical racism to its present day legacies in order to inspire racial justice action. The work began in Coos Bay, Oregon, with this question: how do you reconcile a lynching? Taylor, it's an honor to have you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Virginia. Thank you for having me this evening, and for all of you watching for taking the time out of your Friday evening to have this crucial conversation. Well, my name is Taylor Stewart, and I'm pleased to be here with you all this evening. You and I are going to have an uncomfortable conversation, but I promise you that on the other end of the difficult part of the story, there's something better waiting for us at the end. Maya Angelou once said, "History, despite its retching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again." Some of the following images may be difficult to take in, but I encourage you to have the courage it takes to sit with them. 4 years ago, I set out to reconcile the lynching of a man named Alonzo Tucker, the most widely documented African-American victim of lynching in Oregon. Alonzo Tucker was 28, married, and a boxer from California. Alonzo Tucker was lynched in Coos Bay, Oregon in 1902 after being wrongfully accused of sexually assaulting a white woman before he was eventually hung from a light pole on the old Marshfield Bridge in front of a crowd of 300. Even children were a part of the lynch mob that left Alonzo Tucker's body hanging there for several hours. Despite this all occurring in broad daylight without a masked man in the crowd, no one would ever be held accountable for his killing. Alonzo Tucker was just one of the thousands of African Americans who were lynched in this country. So, how do you reconcile a lynching? How do you find justice for historical injustice? Admittedly, 4 years ago, I was not the person to answer such a question. But I took a trip to the South after college that changed my life. I went on a civil rights immersion trip where we went to Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas and saw various locations of historical significance. I had especially been looking forward to the portion of the trip where we'd be going to Montgomery because we had plans to see the new Equal Justice Initiative museums. You see, I was a big fan of Brian Stevenson, the executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative, and I had heard about these museums in one of my college classes. In April 2018, the Equal Justice Initiative opened up 2 museums. The first was the Legacy Museum, which chronicles the link between slavery and mass incarceration with the belief that slavery didn't end in 1865, it just evolved. The second was the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, or the Lynching Museum. The Equal Justice Initiative has documented nearly 6,500 lynchings of African Americans between the years of 1865 to 1950. When you enter the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, you're confronted with these 6-foot-high pillars that have the name of the state, the name of the county, and then the names of everyone who was lynched in the county. I had always known about lynching in the abstract, but to actually read the names of people who were lynched in this country made this history personal. I had no idea the magnitude of it all. Name after name after name. What personalized this history for me the most was seeing names with the last name Stewart, knowing that simply time and place separated me from the name on that pillar. As you make your way through the museum, the pillars, which are originally perpendicular to the ground, begin to come off the floor until finally they are hanging above you. There's something powerful about having to crane your neck backwards to continue reading the names, causing you to visualize the way many of the victims of lynching died. As you continue, you begin to learn more about what was the culture of lynching in America. You learn that minor social transgressions could get you lynched. You learn that asking for a fair price in trade could get you lynched. You learn that sometimes when the white mob couldn't find who they were looking for, they would simply just lynch an innocent bystander. When you stand in the center of the museum and look around you, you are surrounded by the pillars, symbolizing the crowds that were so frequently present at these events. I'll never forget, when we were at the center of the museum, our tour guide told us about her hometown in Alabama. This was a small town, and in this small town, businesses close early on Wednesdays. Not your big stores like Walmart or Walgreens, but your local stores, your mom and pop stores. They close early on Wednesdays because that's just tradition. Well, that tradition started so that everyone could make it to the lynchings on time because lynchings were held on Wednesdays. And despite the history of that tradition, businesses still close early on Wednesdays in this small Alabama town. I was awestruck. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice was the most heartbreaking part of our trip. I couldn't believe that no one had ever told me about lynching in America before. I couldn't believe that I had gone 22 years in this country knowing nothing about this history, and most importantly, I couldn't believe that no one was talking about this. Why do we not talk about lynching in America? We talk about 9/11 as America's first experience with terrorism, but that's simply not true. There had long been an era of domestic terrorism in the United States, nearly 6,500 lynchings. That's more than just nearly 6,500 individuals. That's nearly 6,500 times the entire African American community sustained an act of domestic terrorism, all in less than 100 years. This should really alter our perception of what life was like in America at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. Lynching left thousands of African Americans dead, imposed racial subordination, forced the exodus of millions from the South, and diminished African Americans in this country's social, political, and economic life in ways that can still be felt today. Visiting the National Memorial for Peace and Justice was a profound encounter with history for me, an encounter that I wanted to bring home and share. Luckily, in conjunction with the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, the Equal Justice Initiative also started the Community Remembrance Project. The Community Remembrance Project aims to work in the communities where the lynchings of African Americans took place to find healing and reconciliation through a sober reflection on history. Now, there was an interest form online, and I would love to say that when I first saw that, I was immediately like, sign me up. How can I help? But in reality, that wouldn't be true. In fact, I was too nervous to fill out the interest form. After all, I was a recent college grad with no relevant experience, and I figured to myself, who am I to really think that I could be of any help? So I decided that I wasn't going to fill out the interest form. But thankfully, 2 encounters from the rest of my trip inspired me to change my mind. The first was a quote from John Lewis, longtime civil rights icon and congressman from Georgia, who asked, "If not us, then who?" If not now, then when? This inspired me with the fierce urgency of now. The second was the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. Here, they just focused on Mississippi history, so there was no mention of individuals like Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, individuals who we kind of deify and are hard to relate to. Instead, the museum told the story of everyday Mississippians who did their part to pave the way for justice. And so, there at the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum is where I learned that you don't have to be an extraordinary person to do extraordinary things. And so, those two encounters gave me the courage to reach out to the Equal Justice Initiative, and 4 years later, here we are. By simply asking the question, how do you reconcile lynching, and being willing to search for an answer, I've learned that there are 3 R words within this idea of reconciliation: remembrance, repair, and redemption. And that in order for us to get to that last R word of redemption, we need to have the courage to undertake the first 2. Because what I've also learned is that our failure to remember and repair our history is what allows injustices like lynching to continue on into today. So, to properly remember the legacy of lynching, we need a deeper understanding of this era of American life. Because, despite what we may like to think, lynching was not the work of a few hooded vigilantes. Whole communities participated in the ritualistic killing of African Americans. The legacy of lynching was not hidden away in the shadows of the night. The legacy of lynching was broadcast in broad daylight on the courthouse lawn. The era of lynching may be behind us, but we as a nation won't ever be able to move past it until we confront this legacy. Lynching was domestic terrorism. And in this era of domestic terrorism, African Americans had to live under the constant fear that their actions could result in a lynching. White individuals accused of identical violations of law or custom were rarely subjected to the same fate. Lynching increasingly became a racialized tool of oppression over the African American population. This history should make us all feel uncomfortable. The barbarity, impunity, and spectacle of lynching are difficult to grapple with. What's most horrifying is the celebration of lynching, the way it was exalted in white communities. When you see pictures of lynchings, it's not the Black bodies that are most disturbing. It's the sea of white faces looking on that are most ominous. The way they smile, the way they lean into frame, I know no greater depths of the depravity of humanity than lynching in America. Black suffering became white entertainment. So, what precipitated lynching? Well, a variety of things. One of the most common was the accusation of sexual assault, which was largely driven by the pervasive fear of interracial sex. During this time period, the mere accusation of rape was enough to incite a mob, and any action that could remotely be interpreted as a Black man seeking sexual contact with a white woman was subject to this pervasive fear. Something as innocuous as a Black man accidentally bumping into a white woman could result in the accusation of sexual assault. When famed anti-lynching advocate Ida B. Wells challenged this myth about lynching and asserted that when in fact there was a charge of rape, in many instances it was really a consensual relationship, a mob burned down her newspaper and threatened to lynch her. More than half of the Equal Justice Initiative lynching victims during the Jim Crow era were killed under some accusation of committing murder or rape. We cannot discount the way that the deep racial hostility of the time inspired increased suspicion on the Black community whenever a crime was discovered, even when little evidence tied the accused to the crime. Minstrel shows, racial science, and the racist chromolithography of the 20th century embedded in the minds of white Americans the presumption of Black guilt, which they attributed to African Americans' perceived moral inferiority. However, it wasn't just accusations of a crime that resulted in lynching. Violating the rules of the social order also had fatal consequences. There was a saying at the time that what the law cannot do, the noose can. African Americans were lynched for things like speaking disrespectfully to a white person, refusing to step off the sidewalk, reprimanding white children, arguing with a white man, and other perceived social infractions. African Americans had to live with the constant knowledge that they could be lynched whether they intentionally or unintentionally violated social norms. And it was this violence that maintained and enforced the racial stratification of the Jim Crow era. I personally cannot imagine what it was like to be Black during this time and to have to travel into the white part of town knowing the slightest misstep could get you killed at any moment. But even more than that, I can't imagine going into the white community with the knowledge that that community was capable of a public spectacle lynching. As horrifying as these images are, we are actually spared from the most horrific element, the sound. These were loud and rambunctious community rituals akin to a sporting event. The roar of the crowd, the deafening boos, and the exuberant jubilation for a victim that finally met their fate incentivized fans to participate in this great American recreation. What I tell people is to remember what it was like the very first time you saw the video of George Floyd, to remember how sick it made you feel to watch someone plead for their life as that life was being taken away from them. But then to imagine that rather than feeling sick, you found that video pleasurable. Not only that, imagine you found it so pleasurable that you would get together with your friends so that you could all enjoy the video together. Imagine getting a whole crowd of people together on that Minneapolis street so you could all be there live for the killing of George Floyd, because that's what public spectacle lynchings were like. Public spectacle lynchings were those in which large numbers of people, sometimes in the thousands, gathered to witness the pre-planned killing of an African American in a manner that included prolonged torture, dismemberment, and or burning of the victim. These were carnival-like events that included food vendors, photographs, and the selling of body parts. Young children would collect the kindling they would use to burn victims alive, and as these children got older, it became a rite of passage into adulthood to take a more active role in this community ritual. Sometimes the mob would discuss how they were going to distribute the lynching victim's body parts in front of the lynching victim while they were still alive. And those body parts would then be kept as cherished family heirlooms and passed from one generation to the next. Public spectacle lynchings were brazen, celebratory acts of sadism that implicated the whole white community and sent a clear message that Blacks were undeserving of even the slightest bit of human dignity. This would be because lynching was always meant to send a message. Lynching was about much more than simply killing someone. It was meant to terrorize. You know, the biggest takeaway from the first week of the Derek Chauvin trial for me was how traumatized the bystanders were from George Floyd's murder. Witnessing that level of callous violence has left an indelible impact on the psyche of these individuals, and they will live with this PTSD for the rest of their lives. I can't even begin to imagine the psychological trauma that resulted from white mobs forcing other Black people to witness lynchings. Some mobs would specifically harness this terror and disrupt any feelings of safety in one's community by conducting their lynchings within the Black part of town, and many other times dragging the body of a lynching victim behind a car throughout the Black community to continually instill this fear. And in the face of this terror, sometimes Black people were lynched simply for asserting their own humanity. The targets of these lynchings were frequently sharecroppers, ministers, or community leaders who resisted mistreatment or espoused Black advancement beyond the confines of the Jim Crow era. These are the lynchings that bother me the most, because if I were doing this work 100 years ago, I would probably be one of these lynching victims. Lynching became a tool to keep African Americans in a state of subjugation and repress African Americans' fight for economic power and equal rights during the 19th and 20th centuries. It is difficult to fathom what life must have been like for African Americans living during this time. One can't even begin to understand the collective trauma associated with these events, having to watch your friends, your family, your community lynched over and over again. We talk about how difficult it was on the Black community to see Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd all killed in such quick succession. I can't even imagine the psychological toll that would have taken had those all been brutal lynchings. I believe we must pay witness to this era of domestic terrorism. We cannot say enough about the psychological wounds inflicted on the African American community, nor can we understate the psychological damage the white community passed on from generation to generation in this socialization of violence. Nor can we ignore our state institutions' indifference and complicity of lynching. So, in 2018, I first reached out to the community of Coos Bay to try and help me begin this process of reconciliation for this history of racial injustice with a series of acts of remembrance. When I tell older African Americans from the Portland area that I'm traveling to Coos Bay or other regions of Southern Oregon, they without fail always ask me two questions. How many people am I going with? And am I prepared to defend myself? Because even in 2022, these questions are still on the forefront of their minds because of Oregon's history of fear and intimidation towards Blacks. Southern Oregon was not the most likely place for this work to begin. In fact, most people thought I was out of my mind for thinking I could put a historical marker about lynching in Coos Bay, Oregon. But what Coos Bay taught me is that no matter where you go, you can find enough people who are willing to choose justice if given the opportunity. It's just a matter of getting them to see where there's been injustice. That's not to say there wasn't a reasonable reluctance to want to remember something as painful as a lynching. But eventually, Coos Bay was able to see that while we can't change the past, we can always change our relationship to the past, and that they had the power to write a new ending to Alonzo Tucker's story. In 2020, we held a soil collection ceremony near the spot of the lynching and collected 2 jars of soil, with each bit of soil representing part of Alonzo Tucker's story. 1 jar was sent back to the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, and the other is now on display at the Coos History Museum. June 2021, we unveiled a historical marker in the community to memorialize Alonzo Tucker and the thousands of other African Americans who were lynched in this country. The historical marker was more than just a retelling of history, it was also the making of history, as over 600 people, double that who were at the 1902 lynching, gathered at the unveiling ceremony to add this new chapter to Alonzo Tucker's story. So, as meaningful as these acts of remembrance were, the lynching of Alonzo Tucker has not yet been reconciled, because remembrance alone is not enough to get to redemption. We need repair. We need to put an end to the harm that lynching continues to cause today. In this case, we are called to repair the fundamental question of who our society believes deserves death, because the answer continues to be people that disproportionately look like me, like Alonzo Tucker. The value of our lives is tied up in this question. Our failure to remember and repair the legacy of lynching is what has allowed it to evolve. Lynching never ended. It simply moved indoors, where all white juries and expedited trials carried out the same verdict as the lynch mob. Because at the same time, lynchings in the United States started to go down, state-sanctioned executions started to go up. During the 1930s, 2/3 of all executions in the United States were of African Americans. Between 1910 to 1950, while only making up 22% of the South's population, African Americans accounted for 75% of all of those who were executed in this region, and this disproportionality continues to today, where African Americans make up 13% of the population, but 41% of those who are on death row. And when we consider the fact that of that 41%, nearly all are African American males, yet African American males only make up 6.5% of our population, we have to ask ourselves, how do we get from 6.5 to 41%? The color of your skin still plays a crucial role in whether our society believes you deserve death or not. When we look at someone and are comfortable saying, you deserve to die, that decision is tainted by racial bias. In 2014, there was a study out of the University of Washington that looked at jurors in Washington state and found that jurors were 3 times more likely to recommend a death sentence for a Black defendant than for a white defendant accused of similar crimes. Nearly every study that has looked at the issue of race of victim and capital punishment sentencing has found that you are more likely to get the death sentence if the victim is white. This is especially true if the defendant is Black. We still treat the accusation of Black on white crime differently. Between 1930 to 1972, 455 individuals in the United States were executed for the charge of rape, and 89% were African American. No white man in the history of the United States has ever been executed for the rape of a Black woman or girl in a non-homicide offense, ever. Of the 316 individuals who have been executed since 1976 for an interracial homicide, 93% have been about Black on white crime. Our society still makes little secret over whose life has value and whose does not. Of the 186 individuals who have been exonerated from death row since 1976, meaning individuals who were wrongfully arrested, wrongfully convicted, wrongfully put in prison, wrongfully put on death row, over half have been African American. We are still trying to kill innocent Black people. In Arkansas, it was recently discovered that the DNA on a murder weapon did not match that of an African American man who had maintained his innocence over the 22 years he was in prison. Only problem is, Arkansas executed this man in 2017. The states in the South, plus Oklahoma and Missouri, had the highest number of lynchings. And since 1976, those states alone have accounted for 86% of all executions in the United States. The same region of the country that lynched is the same region of the country that executes. We have been too busy asking ourselves the question, does this person deserve to die for their crimes, that we haven't first asked ourselves the question, do we deserve to kill? Because if the answer is no, then it doesn't matter what the answer is to that first question. Did you know Germany doesn't have the death penalty? Germany knows that given their history, it would be unconscionable for the country of Germany to systematically execute its citizens, especially if a disproportionate number of those citizens were Jewish. the world would be in outrage. We in the United States would be outraged if that were the case. Yet where's that same outrage when given our history, the United States systematically executes its citizens and a disproportionate number of those citizens are African American? Where is the outrage when given our history as a state, a disproportionate number of African Americans sit on Oregon's death row? Because I don't hear any outrage. 4 years ago, I set out to reconcile the lynching of Alonzo Tucker, and that is still my goal. I've just learned along the way that reconciliation requires more than remembrance. But I can't find this reconciliation on my own. We have a responsibility to the history that we inherit, and that history is calling for us to end the death penalty in Oregon. We need to ask the question, how do you reconcile lynching, and have the courage to search for an answer. We need to be outraged over injustice. We need to get our friends, our family, and the wider community of the Northwest to be inspired with the fierce urgency of now. If not us, then who? If not now, then when? We need remembrance and repair so that we can hopefully one day bring this story to a place of redemption. By using repair in Alonzo Tucker's story to end the death penalty in Oregon, we can bring his memory a semblance of redemptive justice, the kind of justice that redeems our pain, our wrongdoing, and our stories. People ask me if I really think this connection between lynching and the death penalty will change hearts and minds. Well, let me tell you, I know it does because it changed my mind. I wasn't always this person. I graduated high school with the dream of becoming a tough on crime prosecutor. I used to be a passionate supporter of the death penalty. I gave a speech my junior year of college in favor of capital punishment, and I'm not that old, so that wasn't that long ago. I've always cared about justice, but then I learned about lynching and I learned about its connection to the death penalty. And I realized that there is no justice unless there's equal justice. Equal justice under law. That's what it says on the Supreme Court. But our system that we depend upon to dispense the most ultimate form of justice is too flawed to produce anything but injustice. I would say it's broken, but it's functioning exactly the way it was intended, as a replacement for lynching. I need redemption too. None of our stories are over. My story is not over, Coos Bay's story is not over, and most importantly, neither is Alonzo Tucker's. We all need redemptive justice, and Alonzo Tucker's story needs one more chapter, an end to lynching in Oregon. You may not think you can make a meaningful difference on this issue, but I believe you can. So I want to leave you with 3 of the most important lessons of my life that I learned on my trip to the South. The first is that it's okay to believe in something even when you've never seen it before. And it's okay to see something even when others don't believe in it. I believe that we can reconcile a lynching. Second, I've learned that it's less about being the right person for the moment as it is about doing the right thing for the moment. When I was younger, I used to think that it was remarkable people that did remarkable things. But the older I've gotten, the more I've realized that it's remarkable things that make remarkable people. And I believe that you can be a part of something that's remarkable. But third, and most importantly, and it really is just that simple, don't underestimate your ability to be the change you want to see in this world, because let me tell you, you don't have to be an extraordinary person to do extraordinary things. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, am I on? Can everybody hear me? Awesome. All righty. Thank you so much, Taylor. Not an easy message to hear. And that's one of the first questions I wanted to ask you. What kind of resistance do you get to your work? And how do you go about organizing in such a way as to overcome reluctance to engage these really horrible historical truths?
Yeah, it's not to say this work hasn't been without its obstacles, but I'm an optimist, and I believe that organizing under a positive message can help inspire people towards change. And so one of the things is, rather than tell a community who they're not, tell them who they can be, and then show them the steps to becoming that community, allowing them to play an active role in their own journey. And so 4 years ago, if I had gone to Coos Bay and was like, all right, it's time for atonement. You terrible people who did this terrible thing, you have no chance of redemption. I need you to do this thing for me. It wouldn't have been successful. But what I've learned is that when I can get people to do something difficult if I promise them something good on the other end. And so people are more willing to do the difficult remembrance, the necessary repair, so that we can get to this idea of redemption. And so that is sort of the mantra that I bring to the work, is that, this work is difficult, but there really is something better waiting for us on the other end. And so that has been what has been successful. And one of the sort of the aftermaths of this work is there really is actual community change through doing this work. Last fall, the Coos History Museum, who I primarily worked with, held a workshop for other museums on diversity programming. And that's a sentence that wouldn't have existed 3 years ago. But because of doing that remembrance, they were ready for this question of repair. This year, so we did the historical marker unveiling on Juneteenth as part of Coos Bay's first ever Juneteenth celebration. And this year, their Juneteenth celebration has grown into a full 3-day event, allowing Black Oregonians to display their history, their culture, and so that as we celebrate freedom, we don't just do that. We celebrate the pursuit of freedom and continue on the legacy that this day causes us to do. And so I really do believe that organizing in this positive fashion is what creates this positive change.
Yeah, that is so exciting to hear about what's happened in Coos Bay. And I think I remember you saying that, it's so painful to think of 300 people showing up to a lynching, but then how many people came to the commemoration?
So we had so about 300 in person and then another 300 to 600 online. And so I just round to 600, just with that idea of like now, so I like to say there are 2 dates of significance on the historical marker. 1902 when the lynching occurred, and then 2021 when the historical marker was unveiled, and that we can't fully understand Alonzo Tucker's story, only focusing on the 1902 date, as his story now continues on into 2020 and 2021 when that same community where his lynching occurred used his memory as inspiration for becoming a community more committed to the ideals of truth, justice, and reconciliation. And so I really do believe that this is now a permanent fixture of our historical memory. And that's part of the thing of, we can't change the past, but we can change our relationship to it. And those stories of injustice, that doesn't have to be where those stories end. We can do things presently to add these new chapters to history. And I believe that through adding those new chapters is how we get to that idea of historical reconciliation.
Nice. Thank you. So one of the first questions that a Black friend asked me when I described your work and how inspiring I found it was, well, how does that help Black people? So Who does this work benefit and why?
I believe that justice work benefits everyone. From the Black perspective, when we think about Alonzo Tucker, we're not stuck at the lynching. And that painful history has a different ending. And we're not left thinking about a community who lynched a man and then completely forgot about it. We can go about this community knowing that people in that community care about that story and took an effort to add a new chapter to his history. And, one of the things is when we had the sort of the historical marker unveiling for African Americans in the community, they were able to be sort of surprised that this amount of people came out in their community to say that they cared about this issue. And so it was an encouragement for African Americans in the Coos Bay area to realize they had more allies than they had previously thought. And so I believe that just the historical remembrance is how we can get to those places of healing, of if we don't do anything, those wounds will, they'll become permanent scars. And we need something if we're ever to get to that place of healing. And so that's, one of the reasons why I believe it benefits African Americans is it can bring the sort of the community a sense of healing. But also I believe that as we transition this conversation to the death penalty, as we look at this fundamental question of who our society believes deserves death, and it continues to be disproportionately African American, that says something about the value of our lives, the value of all African American lives, that this is who we're willing to disproportionately sentence to death. And so I believe that we need that statement, that abolishing of the death penalty to repair that fundamental question. And that's what motivates me. That's what gives me the fierce urgency of now, is to really settle this fundamental question in our society.
Thank you. And I have a thank you from the audience as well. It says, thank you, Taylor, for your courage and clarity to reveal the truth and move us together towards healing and restoration.
Thank you.
So I have a couple of questions that are related. So I'll give you both at once. They have to do with your work in Coos Bay. And it's sort of like, well, how did you find people to work with? And where did you start? And how long did it take for you to make the connections to do that work?
Yeah, so I filled out the Equal Justice Initiative interest form the summer of 2018. And then a few months later, the Equal Justice Initiative got back to me with the email of 3 other people who had filled out the same form for Oregon. And so I was like, okay, great. I'm gonna someone else, I'll be able to help other people do this. And then I was like, okay, there's no way I know how to do this project, but I can send out the first email. And so I worked up the courage to send out the first email. And then it was like, surprise, everyone's from Portland. And I was like, that's not helpful. But because we were all from Portland, we decided to get together at a McMinimum's downtown. And I'll never forget driving to that McMinimum's thinking to myself, I can't wait to meet who's going to lead this. And then I remember driving home and I was like, mother, I was like, what just happened? What just happened? And so honestly, I don't completely remember what my strategy was at the very start. I was just going around telling people I was going to do this thing. And I had been thinking in my head, how could I make a sort of compelling argument to Coos Bay? And in doing so, I eventually got in contact with someone who worked at our big hospital. It's called OHSU, and he was in charge of some of their rural health. And he put me in touch with, there was a history museum there, and that was perfect. And so I reached out to the history museum, and that's sort of how this work all started. And that was about the winter of 2018. And then things just sort of grew from there. And then it took about another year and a half till we got to the soil collection.
All right. Thank you. Wow. What a journey. So I have a question here. In Germany, they teach about the Holocaust in schools. Do you think that we should work toward teaching US history of lynching in our Washington or Oregon or other Pacific Northwest schools? I think there's a real tendency to think, well, that happened in the South. That didn't happen here. We don't have to deal with that miserable history when we're teaching history here. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that there are a multitude of reasons why we need to educate about this history, because while it predominantly happened in the South, there were hundreds of lynchings that occurred in the North, the West, the Northeast. And so our history, though it may be removed slightly from the South, it's really just because we had less Black people. It had nothing to do with the lack of racism or the lack of the same cultural climate. There were just less Black people. And so if you were to look at, the per capita of Black people and the number of lynchings, it would be just as high, if not higher than the South. And so this question is still pertinent to us in the outside of the traditional South. And so I'm a big believer that this is such a crucial part of American history. It seems that in many of our history books, we get to the Civil War, and then there's just like this mystery 100 years, and then we pop back in for like the civil rights movement and fighting segregation, where we really never discuss those 100 years with thousands of lynchings and how that impacted the way that African Americans' rights were rescinded following the Civil War and Reconstruction. African Americans had more rights in 1870 than they did in 1950. And that's because of the way that this violence enforced the pushback against African American rights. And so I believe this to be a fundamental sort of issue for us as Americans. And I'm a big believer that, as we take this history, it really forces us to deconstruct our image of America. But what I do believe to be also equally important is the idea that we also have the power to reconstruct that image into something new, potentially something even better. And so, yes, we learn about the legacy of lynching that forces us to rethink America. If we were to enter a generation, a new era of historical repair, I believe that we could build our image of America into something better.
Yes. Thank you. So let's see. I've got a bunch of questions here, but talking about the fact that there are not very many Black people in the Pacific Northwest kind of brings me to a question that I had in my head when we started, which was, what about why there are so few Black people in the Pacific Northwest? And I know that you're working with Grants Pass, Oregon, which was a sundown town. You're working on the Sunrise Project, and Bellingham also was a sundown town. Can you explain what that is and tell us a little bit about how the work is going?
Yeah. So one of the reasons why there are so few Black people is because of the culture of hostility that was created. And so the Oregon Territory, which did encompass the wider portion of the Northwest, passed two Black exclusionary laws. And so they sort of made it illegal for Black people to come to Oregon. At the first instance of the Black exclusionary law, they actually also instituted something called the Lash Law. It was called Peter Burnett's Lash Law, where if African Americans were in the state of Oregon, they had to be whipped no less than 22 times, but no more than 39 times. While that law was never actually implemented, that still set a precedent for the kind of culture that we were creating here in the Northwest. And so when Oregon became a state, we had in our Constitution a clause that prohibited Black people from being in the state, owning property, making contracts. And so it wasn't until 1926 that we removed that from our Constitution. And so, one of the reasons why there weren't really that many Black people is because we created such a culture of hostility. And many of that is what became in the Northwest and in the the Northeast, generally in most places outside the traditional South, were what were called sundown towns. Sundown towns were communities that purposefully excluded African Americans or other racial minorities from living in the town. There's a famous case of a town in Illinois called Anna, where Anna, A-N-N-A, stands for Ain't No Niggers Allowed. And there's this culture of violence that enforced sundown towns. And in many ways, it was actually lynchings that made a town go sundown town. There would be a large lynching. They would push the African Americans out of that community, and that's how it became a sundown town. African Americans were actually more widely dispersed in 1870 than they were in 1930. It's kind of called the Great Retreat, where African Americans had to retreat out of these rural spaces into condensed urban centers because of the hostility that arose in many parts of the country. And so I'm starting some of this historical reflection in the community of Grants Pass, Oregon, another community in Southern Oregon. There was a sign in Grants Pass into the late 1960s, early 1970s that said, "Nigger, don't let the sun come down on you here." And so the goal, similar to the story of Alonzo Tucker, is to rewrite the ending to the story of a sundown town. And I believe that we can create this ending where a formerly exclusionary community can become one of the communities most intentionally committed to inclusivity because of its history. It's called the Sunrise Project, with the idea that sunrise is the opposite to sundown and signals the start of a new day. And so our tagline is from sundown to sunrise as we try and create this idea of a sunrise community. And what I love to tell people is that I wish it was my idea to use the word sunrise, but that idea came from a 69-year-old white male truck driver from Grants Pass. But that's sort of what this is all about, bringing together ordinary people to do extraordinary things. And so right now we're working on an educational resource about what sundown towns look like, both nationally and locally, how that exclusion evolved into the present, and then the next steps a community can take to building a more inclusive environment. And so included within that is an oral history component to collect the firsthand memories of those who remember sundown towns in Oregon, from the white perspective, who remember their community as a sundown town, as well as African Americans who remember navigating sundown towns in Oregon and generally the Northwest as a whole. And so we're looking to culminate this work in the installation of a historical marker, one side talking about racial exclusion in Oregon and Grants Pass, and the other side functioning as the community's stated commitment to inclusivity. And so while it's the culmination of work, it's the start of a never-ending journey to live out the ideals that are on that marker. And if we're successful, it will be the first marker about sundown towns in the United States. And the goal is to expand into other communities in Oregon and create this blueprint that other communities across the country can follow.
Woohoo. I want to hear more. I want to hear how it goes. And I also am hoping very much that this conversation that we're having is going to help that goal of spreading the word that this work can happen and that anyone can do it. Mm-hmm. Even people who go to the first meeting thinking, gosh, I wonder who's going to lead the charge here.
Yeah, one of the biggest, so there's a quote from New Jersey Senator Cory Booker that I've always loved of, don't let your inability to do everything stop you from doing one thing. And so 4 years ago, I would have been frozen if I had tried to come up with this whole plan about how I was going to put a historical marker about lynching in Coos Bay, Oregon. But what I could do, and that was that one thing, is send out an email. And that one thing just kept growing and growing and growing. And I believe that's how we do this work. And so when people leave this conversation, it's not about how can I go in the death penalty across the United States. It can be something as simple as, how can I tell one other person about lynching in America and its connection and its relevancy to us today, and then tell someone else and then tell someone else. As you keep doing those one little thing, that's how we make a bigger difference in the collective whole.
Thanks. Okay, I have another question here. It's a kind of a long one. So given that the police have been central to historical lynchings, continuing into contemporary public executions, and knowing that police reforms have been largely ineffective in changing the culture and actions of police departments across the country, do you feel that police abolition is key to repairing the wrongs committed against Black communities?
So, I think that in this conversation, there needs to be a necessary division between our concept of law enforcement and then our concept of policing in America. Law enforcement is a necessary part of any civil society and is not inherently negative, but there is this element of policing in America that has this larger history of injustice. And so, you know, I think that our main goal isn't defunding law enforcement. Our idea is reimagining what public safety looks like. And so that does mean that we accept that our system of public safety as it currently exists doesn't meet the needs of the whole of our community. And so I believe that when we have these conversations, it's, so structurally, I believe the phrase defund the police is a losing phrase, not because I don't agree with the ideals behind it, but structurally, defund is a negative word that you're doing to something the general populace assumes to be positive. And so your phrase is doing a negative to a positive. And it only works if the general populace doesn't assume police to be a negative word. It only works amongst a certain group of people, which is why I'm a strong proponent of the ideas of reimagine public safety. Reimagine is a neutral to positive word that you're doing to a positive word, because it's this thing that we all want. And so when it comes to reimagining public safety, it includes restructuring our system of policing. Let's take away many of the responsibilities that law enforcement has that they don't necessarily need to be doing. Let's create more social service agents within policing so that we can allow them to do law enforcement and have other individuals to deal with the societal troubles, our mental health issues, things that we don't need someone with a gun to go do. And so I think it is less. It is so, if the problem, the phrase defund the police is we're doing this thing, but it's just, we need to restructure and recategorize how we want to do public safety. We still have the same idea, the same funding. It's just how we restructure that budget. You know, we don't necessarily have to fire all of these police officers because we took away their budget. We can just transition them to other roles. There may be older police officers that don't necessarily want to show up to burglaries all the time, but want to continue being a police officer to get the pension and all the benefits. Allow them to do something else, still be a part of what they care about, which is public safety. And so I believe that, so the question of police abolition, I do is the abolition of the system of policing as it has existed in American history. But it is the creation of these systems of public safety that do include law enforcement and do include the necessary elements of safety that don't necessarily violate laws.
Thank you.
That's just my 2 cents.
All right. Here's another one for you. This one sounds a little bit like a statement looking for a question, but I'll share it anyway. It's some good thoughts here. I see racism, sexism, and classism as interrelated. Though each of these is separate, racism and sexism are used by the economic elite, aka ruling class, as wedges to divide and conquer, in my belief. Our nation's recent 45th president was a prime example of this. Is that your perception as well?
So one of the things that I am interested in doing, because I have crazy ideas, is I want to open a museum about the Confederacy in the South. a museum about the Confederacy from the perspective of racial justice individuals. And so, because I actually don't know that much about what happened, what the social structure was of the Confederacy. And out of mere historical curiosity, I don't know where to go for answers, because many of the people that I could find plenty of reading material from the Daughters of the Confederacy, but that's not a source I want to read. And so I have this idea. So ideally, I wish the Equal Justice Initiative would do this. And so when I meet Brian, I'm like, Brian, I have an idea for you. And to be able to, with so much of this Confederate history, the statue removal is like, where's our history going to go? And I believe it can go right here in a museum where it belongs, not in the public square where we lionize these sort of statues. And the reason why I bring that up is I'm interested in the way that the Confederacy shaped the sort of the structure of, because if poor whites and the slaves had gotten together, they would have overpowered the planter class. But it was that creation of racial difference, that creation of this racial divide that was so prominent in this region of the country that I believe is part of this legacy that the ruling class still uses today. And I find that, and for many times, to help people understand the way things exist presently in a little bit more of a gray area, go back in time where it's a little bit more obvious, where it's really obvious the way the planter class separated the poor whites and the slaves. And then we can sort of trace that legacy to the way that the modern day planter class separates us across these societal lines to prevent us from creating that sort of collective power that we could actually use to reshape our society.
All right. Yes. Okay, there's two questions that I've seen over here. One is, where in Washington, do you know of places in Washington where these horrible historical events occurred? And then there's also someone shared in the chat that Lebanon, Oregon was also a sundown town, and that this person heard that it didn't end in Lebanon until the 1970s. So that's a little tidbit about another community in Oregon. I don't know if you know about locations in Washington. I do know that there was a lynching in Washington state of a Native American, or actually, I think it was actually in Canada, and it was like a Canadian Native American, and Washingtonians went across the border and seized this person and lynched them. So I don't know all the details, but that happened near the border, so in Whatcom County. Do you know of places in Washington or Idaho or Montana?
I don't know that much about Washington, Idaho, or Montana, but I do think that is the sort of there's lots of things about Oregon that I don't even know, but it is just sort of taking, regardless of what information you do or do not know, we have these histories of injustice. How can we bring them to the surface so that we can heal from them? And so I encourage people to look into the history of your community. Anybody can do this work. It doesn't have to be the eventual creation of these historical markers. But this is so in Grant's past, this really just started with one stay-at-home mom that was like, our community used to be a sundown town. And so she created this little pamphlet to simply try to educate her community. And it's those little things is that how we've grown into the Sunrise Project. But anybody can educate their community. It doesn't have to be big. You don't have to talk at City Hall, but you can get people in your church, in your neighborhood, to care about our local history. If I had to guess, a very prominent thing in Oregon that I imagine in Washington is restrictive covenants, the racial covenants that were on housing that really sort of came about during the 1920s, 1930s, that most houses still have today in historic neighborhoods. And so something as simple as I live so there's, certain neighborhoods in the Portland area that's very prominent. It's, what has happened in my community. We have such a wide history of racial injustice that I am sure you can find something in your town, in your county. And so, even in your house. And so it is just finding these ways that we can get involved, because we are, it's sort of ignorance isn't bliss when it comes to histories of racial injustice. We are harmed because our ignorance creates us to be perpetrators. Through ignorance, we perpetrate. And so it is learning this history, trying to do something about it so that we can really get to this better place as a society because we've done this healing work.
Right. And I know that the Ku Klux Klan had a really active presence in Washington state in the 1920s. I mean, it was like a giant social club and parades and all kinds of things. And so, yeah, you don't have to scratch very deep to come up with something.
In the Portland area, I'm starting to do some things regarding history of anti-Asian violence. And the reason many of the Chinese immigrants came from Washington, specifically Tacoma, and it was because of they called it the I can't remember, but in Tacoma they just burned the Chinatown to the ground, and those refugees from violence came to the Portland area where they were once again continuously dispersed. And so there is, this history of racial exclusion in Washington. I know that the exclusion of, because the guy who led the anti-Chinese movement in Washington came to Portland. And so much of our thing is because of what came from Washington.
Yes, thank you. I had heard about that too.
Oh, so. If you Google the Tacoma Method, that is what they called it, the sort of systemic way that they got rid of the Chinese from Tacoma.
Yeah, I think I actually just read something about that not too long ago. And
there's a whole website.
I read a news story just recently about the Supreme Court in Washington saying you can't eliminate those racial covenants from the records. You can make them so that they have no power. You can,
interesting.
You can negate their power, but you can't eliminate them. And it's because they don't want people to be able to just like erase that history.
Interesting. So my strategy for Oregon is we have passed some legislation that has made it easier, but it's still pretty difficult because it actually is really difficult to remove these clauses from your deeds. And my hope isn't that so I do want us to remove them, but I want us to document them so that, yes, they don't exist on our deeds. So when someone, they just bought their dream house and it's like, oh, by the way, like niggers can't live here. And you're like, I know it doesn't apply here, but this dampens my feelings toward my house. And so I want to remove them, but document them so that we do have a map preserving their history while getting rid of the personal ways that it can affect people. So yeah, good luck in Washington.
No, I can definitely see the benefit of what you're saying there. One of the questions here is, how do you remain positive and solution focused when it's so easy to fall into despair?
I think partly I'm young. I'm an optimist, but it really is a lot of this comes from the idea that we lose hope when we stop believing individuals and communities can change. So I choose to remain hopeful, and I have that hope because of my own shift in life. I grew up in a conservative, white, evangelical environment, and I very much was a product of that environment. I went to a high school where a correct answer on our US history test was that the biggest misconception about the Civil War was that it was about slavery. And so I went to school in Portland, Oregon, and I still got the lost cause ideology. And I graduated high school, a registered Republican. wanting to be a tough on crime prosecutor. But having been able to learn about our history, be provided with a means of looking at it. And the biggest epiphany for me was the way that these historical racisms don't just end, but they are the reasons why we have present day disproportionalities, and that our present is so connected to our history. And it was seeing the way that those things were connected, realizing that the answer to the question I'd wondered my whole life of what would I have done had I been around during the civil rights era was, what was I doing right now? And so because of my own change and my own transformation, it gives me reason, optimism to believe in hope and change in others.
Thank you for that infusion of hope. So I have another question here. Says, I would love to hear your thoughts on the initiatives to keep white children from being made to feel guilty about being white because of historical horrors that, of course, they personally had nothing to do with.
I think that guilt isn't an inherently negative feeling. Only if you get stuck in there. Guilt should be sort of from that feeling of, it should be a reason to move towards positive. And guilt isn't bad. It just means that you're human and that you can understand that injustice was perpetrated. And so, we have this responsibility to the history that we inherit. And when we feel those feelings of negativity that may make us feel sad, that is when we should then channel that feeling into how we can do something positive. And the error that we'll make if we don't teach these histories of injustice, we won't create people who are inspired to do something about them. And those feelings of negativity doesn't have to be the end of it. When we do the remembrance and the repair, we can get to that redemptive justice. And so if we can't get to that better place unless we do what's difficult. And that's why it takes courage. And that's why we need to inspire our young people to have that courage to learn about their history and then figure out what they can do about it. And so, I do think that this is there are problems of people who do bring that layer of condemnation, that I don't believe that negativity spurs positive action. And so I do believe that there are those who bring the sort of fire and brimstone, forcing people into atonement for the history they weren't personally a part of, is not beneficial to our actual goal. And so I do believe that much of that feelings of negativity comes from the feeling of powerlessness. And so I really want to give people power when it comes to these stories of injustice, the fact that they have power to rewrite the ending. And so I believe that guilt is also partly to the feeling of powerlessness. But if we do believe that we have a power to do something about these histories, I think that there won't be as much fear. And I do feel it's that fear, that guilt is sort of this umbrella term for the actual things happening underneath. The fear, the powerlessness. And I do believe that if we do these other things, we can move past it. And it takes courage to deal with that negative feeling and translate it into something else. And so I do believe that the answer to, these people who are trying to stop this historical education is, how can we give people the opportunities to feel like they have power for these stories? Yes, you can't do something about slavery. You can't go back to 1865. But what you can do is commit yourself to being a part of repairing the legacy of slavery. If your family owned slaves, you can't do anything about that. But what you can do is really hone in on being a part of upending the system of mass incarceration that we have today. You yourself as an individual can't overturn this mammoth system, but what you can do is find that one thing you can do to contribute. That could just be committing to bail funds, like writing to your legislature, writing to inmates, whatever you feel is best to match you, that's how you can be a part of this historical repair. And yes, we learn about these histories, but when we learn about figures like Harriet Tubman, we can learn about how to be a part of her legacy. And so I believe that it's that feelings of power that you actually can make an effect is sort of how we eventually get rid of this pushback towards historical education.
Nice. Let's see, I have another question for you, and it's related to some of the other things that people have said, but how do you see the future of the Oregon Remembrance Project, and how would your work be affected if there were remembrance projects in other Western states? And do you know of any community remembrance projects in other Western states?
So, whether it's by title or not, this remembrance work is happening across the West. Even if it's as simple as like, yeah, maybe historical markers aren't going up, but people are putting up murals. They are finding ways of bringing these stories up to the surface. And so, yes, they don't have the organizational designation of a remembrance project, but there is remembrance work happening. And one of the things of, maybe you don't feel you're able to start something, figure how you can support the remembrance work that is happening in your community. Because as much as you dig, you will find these stories of injustice. But if you dig even deeper, you'll find the people who are trying to do something about it. And so even though there aren't necessarily organizations doing this same work, we'll see. Fast forward maybe 20 years and I'll be like, I'm in Washington too. So we'll see. But for now, if you followed, I given a TED talk at the end of May. I got to update some of my stuff before then. That's what I'm working on right now. But if you follow the Oregon Remembrance Project on social media, you'll be able to Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter, keep updated and figure out how you can sort of learn from what's happening in Oregon and then apply it into your own community.
Nice. Thank you. So you talking about bringing an end to the death penalty in Oregon, the death penalty being kind of the pinnacle of what's wrong in our racism in our criminal justice system. But how do you see remembrance, repair, and redemption being applicable to other aspects of our society, and particularly other aspects of the criminal justice system?
Yeah, so I think that the ultimate question when it comes to lynching and the death penalty is who our society believes deserves death. But I believe the layer right below is how do we punish those who offend us? And that means that taking that look of both our criminal justice system, our education system, how are we punishing those who have committed offenses? Are we seeking retribution or are we seeking restoration? And it's the separation between those two of, I do believe that mercy is a prerequisite to just accountability. And it is that mercy that allows us to stay away from retribution to actually get to these places of just accountability. And so I do believe that it's what do we do with those who have offended us is that next layer question that does deal with the larger element of the criminal justice system, but also school discipline. Who are we disproportionately punishing? Those who have offended the system. And so I do believe that is that next question that is relevant to Washington, even though you don't have a death penalty. How are we punishing those who've offended us in these different sort of systems in our society?
Yeah. No, I know that, people here in Whatcom County have been looking at our jail and finding disproportionate numbers of people of color. So yeah, you don't have to look very hard to start finding examples. And one just popped out at me right before this, before the webinar started. I was reading a newsletter from the Friends Committee on National Legislation, and it's telling a story of February 2021. So just a little over a year ago, the Austin family bought and renovated a house in Marin City, very expensive, swanky area. And despite the location and putting $400,000 into renovations, it appraised at $989,000, which was just $100,000 more than its appraisal before the $400,000 renovations. They suspected racism and they got a second appraisal, and they staged the house to make it seem like a white family owned it. And the house was appraised at almost 1.5 million. So 50% more than the previous appraisal. So how do you see the historical legacy of oppression and racism in these really lynching and redlining, and how it kind of evolves into this? Can you talk a little bit about that?
I do believe that the answer to, yes, Oregon didn't have slavery, but we had exclusionary laws that prohibited people from generating wealth. The way that we excluded African Americans from institutions, opportunities, and the ability to accumulate wealth, I believe, is the reason why we have these. I believe the biggest injustice is not about policing. It is about the racial wealth gap. And there are reasons of our history that have contributed to that. And it doesn't have to be just because of slavery. The ways that our society here in the Northwest instigated the obstacles for African Americans and other people of color to build wealth is the same reason why we have racial disproportionalities. The biggest, redlining didn't just prevent people from buying houses. It prevented them from buying houses in places that would grow and accumulate generational wealth. And it pushed them into places that were then frequently pushed again. It's hard to build wealth when your home is being separated into other places. And so we can understand why there's a racial wealth gap today because of what's happened over these last 100 years. And so I do believe the answer is both simple and complicated. The answer is reparations. And it does have, need to come from a societal whole that we remember what has happened because of this history. We go about repairing it so that we can get to these places of redemption. For me personally, I believe that the answer to the state founded with Black exclusionary laws, I believe that we can rewrite that ending. I want Oregon to be intentionally involved in recruiting African Americans and other people of color to come live in the state. And sometimes that may mean financial advertisement, financial incentives. People always say, why are there no Black people in the Northwest? Again, that doesn't have to be the end of the story. We can and we should. People are moving to the Northwest every day. They're not people of color. But what can we do in our society to make our communities more welcoming, more enticing to people of color? And so, the whole issue of reparations is very, very far away. But don't let our inability to do that stop us from doing the one things that we can do. And it is changing our small communities, our organizations, our churches, our neighborhoods to be more welcoming and enticing for these ideas that we are committed to remembering our histories of injustice and doing the necessary things to put an end to the harm that they create. And so no one's going to be able to just, I'm going to go get reparations in Washington. That would be, hats off to you. But what you can do is get started in this remembrance and repair to build this larger culture, this community, this state of people that are committed to these ideals. People do things when they feel like they've done it before. And so if we want to get to reparations, we got to bring people slowly up to there. And so it is starting with unearthing our stories of injustice, doing things about them, making substantive changes to our society, and eventually we'll get to that final ideal of reparations, but we got to start somewhere.
And starting with looking at the history and educating ourselves and one another about it is where that starts, people start to feel really clear about what's just, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the things I wanted to share, if anybody doesn't happen to be looking at their chat or they're watching on YouTube, is that people are sharing in the chat, they're looking up on the internet as we're talking. And one thing that's listed here is a book called Midnight Justice, Lynching and Law in the Pacific Northwest. And someone else found a website and was looking up their town, like you were able to look up town by town and see. So there's a lot of information out there, and not very hard to find. So we're getting lots of messages of appreciation in the chat. So I'll just share a couple of those. I just want to say how much I appreciate this. And thank you for this excellent, powerful, and informative interactive presentation. And may humanity continue to develop its humanity. And so it's really, there's a nice activity going on in the chat, people sharing ideas and inspiration. So already the conversation has begun, and people are starting to feel excited about, oh, look what's possible. Look what we can do.
That, you've made my whole week, you've made my month, you've made my weekend. And so that earlier question of what keeps me going, what keeps me smiling, is having these interactions to learn that people are sort of taking this inspiration and turning it into action. It's not about dismantling these whole systems in a single day. It's how can we do the small things in our interpersonal lives, in our small communities. And so the response from you all, I can't see you, I can only see the panelists. And so I just want to thank you all for not only being here, but then willing to take that next step. You've already shown courage sitting through the presentation. And so I know that you have the courage to continue on in this work. And I'm so grateful. And if I can ever be of any help to you in your historical reflection, your historical reconciliation work, you can get in contact with me at the Oregon Remembrance Project's website. Doing a website redesign, but I'm still able to reach the contact form. And so feel more than welcome to reach out to me there, and I'd be happy to help you along the way.
Yeah, thank you so much. Oh, a different mirror is being cited on Wikipedia. So that's another thing that people can look up, is a different mirror. I wonder, speaking of inspiration and the fact that people that are on this call, who, by the way, I just want to pause for a minute and say that everybody who's on this in this webinar, you are my heroes, because you're the ones that showed up to hear painful stories, and yet with a belief that we can make things better, that there can be remembrance, repair, and that we can work towards redemption for our communities and for our nation. So, and while we're talking about inspiration, I did want to ask you, Taylor, to talk a little bit about Bryan Stevenson, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, and how he's influenced you.
Yeah, this is a perfect bookend. I have to hop off in just a sec. But this is, I was inspired by Bryan Stevenson. I saw his TED Talk my senior year of college called "We Need to Talk About Injustice." And I was like, I want to be like that guy. Little did I know how my life would unfold. He came to Portland in 2019 on Martin Luther King Day. And I was supposed to be somewhere else that day. But when I found out Bryan Stevenson was speaking, I was like, I gotta go. And I canceled my other plans, and I was like, I'm gonna go see Bryan Stevenson. And so he was speaking at this Jewish synagogue in town, and It's in Northwest Portland. It's really hard to get to. And so I spent like a half hour looking for parking, and I was just panicking. I was like, I can't find parking. And there was like a parking thing like a block away that I didn't know. I was very upset when I finally found it. And so by the time I get to the synagogue, it's standing room only. I'm all the way in the very, very back. It's people, me, the door. And he gave his usual speech about how we need to be more proximate to historical injustice, that we can't change the world from afar. We have to get proximate to the things that we want to change. And what stood out to me the most was what he said at the very end. And that's, the next time I come back to Portland, I want you to have gotten rid of your death penalty in Oregon. And so me in the very, very back was like, okay, Brian, I'll try my best. And so this work has just sort of all come from the inspiration that I've received from Bryan Stevenson. I have 3 life goals. 1, in the death penalty in Oregon. 2, open what's called the Center for Reconciliation in Portland. And 3, do for someone what Bryan Stevenson has done for me. I don't know if I'll ever accomplish that last one, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying. If you're not familiar with Bryan Stevenson, you may have seen trailers for the movie Just Mercy with Michael B. Jordan. That was about Bryan Stevenson. He is a lawyer in Montgomery, Alabama, doing work to represent those who are on death row. And his work has evolved to now be really about the sort of what narratives are we creating about racial injustice, our history, these racial differences. And so I highly recommend Just Mercy. It's based on a book of the same title. I really do like the movie Just Mercy, but I actually like his HBO documentary even better. It's called True Justice. And you can actually find it on YouTube if you don't mind a little watermark. And so I just encourage you to Google any and everything Bryan Stevenson. Go on YouTube, look up clips, interview clips. He's on plenty of podcasts. And so I hope that by diving into the work of Bryan Stevenson, you too will be equally inspired, and that you'll be able to sort of go on and continue that legacy yourself.
Thank you so much, Taylor. I realize we're over time. I just want to say that I hope that your story and this talk will be just the beginning of needed conversations throughout the West. And thank you so much for sharing your work with us.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
So it's time to say goodnight, everyone. Thank you for being here. As we close, we're going to play an a cappella rendering of Lift Every Voice and Sing by Jafari the Finest. That's the stage name of a former attender of Bellingham Friends meeting. So many thanks to Jafari for permission to share this song.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. Let us march on till victory is won.